There's one subject that I don't think I can emphasize too much in here, and that is the difference between how we think of things and how people in the Bible times thought of them. In 2 years, we'll have the 250th anniversary of the United States. And you just look back in 250 years, how much things have changed. How much different people think of things. How much different life is. Just think in 250 years, the history of the United States as a country, how things have changed. 8 times that amount of time is what goes back to the New Testament time. So you imagine how things have changed since the time of George Washington in this country. You multiply that by 8, and you get an idea of how much things have changed from biblical times up to now. Just think about that for a minute. I think it's something that we just can't wrap our minds around, how much different life is, how much different people think about things. We live in a different world than those people lived in. So the people back in biblical times looked at things a lot differently than we do. Their whole worldview was different than ours. One of the ways it was so different is that they saw spiritual powers and spiritual beings everywhere. To them, the world was full of spiritual powers. As one biblical scholar put it, they saw the world as being enchanted. And I know we think of enchanting like casting a spell, but what that means really is enchanted means that things in the world that happen are influenced by spiritual powers. And so in biblical times, people believed that the world was full of spiritual powers that used their powers in the world. We see them referenced many times in the Bible, but many times we skip over them not knowing what they are. Some of the terms they are referred to are the gods, the watchers, the sons of God, principalities and powers, powers of the air, powers of the heavens, rulers and authorities. And sometimes we see some reference that we are familiar with, like angels, demons, unclean spirits. Back in biblical times, these various spiritual powers were seen as exerting influence and even control over things that happen on earth. Some were seen as being good and tried to help us. Others were seen as being bad and were trying to harm us. Now, these powers, especially the ones that were seen as being not good, were not seen as acting in concert, not seen as cooperating together. They were seen as going their own ways, doing different things, at odds with each other, competing with one another. One might be trying to do this, another might be trying to stop him and do this. So it was just a competing battleground among these powers. The way modern people look at things, though, is very different. Many modern people who have been influenced by science do not believe there are such things as spiritual powers in the world. They believe science that tells them there is no such thing as a spiritual power. There is nothing that exists that we cannot see, observe, and measure. Now, these people may believe in God, but more often they believe in God as an abstract, like an undefined power, or some kind of rule or something like that, an impersonal force. But many Christians who accept the fact that there are spiritual powers still look at it in a very limited way. You just say God. When we think of spiritual powers, chances are most of us think of God up in heaven with a few angels. And that's about it. If we think of the devil at all, we just think of the devil. And that's it. So our view of these things is very, very limited. It is very different from the view that you find in the Bible, where the world was actually full of competing spiritual powers. Today, even among Christians who believe in spiritual powers, it's mainly God, an angel or two, and maybe the devil, and that's it. Now, as part of the belief back in biblical times that the world was full of spiritual powers, a lot of Christians believed in the idea of what's called guardian angels. We've talked about that in before. This is the belief that every Christian, or every person actually, has an angel or angels assigned just to them to be guides and protectors. Now, this is not emphasized in Protestant circles, but there is scriptural basis for that. You can use the Bible and build a good case that each person has a or several guardian angels. In our communion prayer, you might have noticed that it has a phrase that God appointed angels as our guardians. So the belief in guardian angels is a reasonable belief. It can be supported by Scripture. Now, in the Old Testament book of 1 Kings, we meet the prophet Elijah. And Elijah had been going around trying to get the people to repent and turn back to God, but he had no success. He had worn himself out, and nobody would pay him any attention. And he got discouraged. He got to the point where he thought, I just can't do this anymore. So he went out to the wilderness, and he lay down under a tree. And he felt he was effective. After all, he had done the best he could do. He got 0 results. He had worn himself out. And he thought, well, I'm a failure. So he lay down under that tree. He didn't have the energy to go on. And he said, God, just let me die. I'm such a failure. Just let me die. I'm no better than anybody else. I'm a failure. So he went to sleep. And then it says an angel came, touched him, and woke him up. The angel said, get up and eat. Elijah looked over here, and the angel had fixed a fire, and he baked him a loaf of bread, and had a pitcher of water there. So he got up and he ate the bread and drank the water. He laid back down and went back to sleep. The angel came back and woke him up. He said, get up and eat. The angel had fixed him more food. So he got up and he ate and drank. And this time, he had more strength. So he got up and went back, tried again, and this time he was successful. He was ready to give up. Perhaps this is an example of a guardian angel. This obviously an example of a spiritual entity coming at Elijah's low point of his life when he wanted to give up and die. The angel came and urged him on, and he went on. And the people did turn back to God. This is an example of what's called a felt presence. We've talked about this episode that I'm going to talk about now before in another context. In the early 1900s, there was a crew of explorers shipwrecked in Antarctica on an island. It was a sparsely populated island. It's cold down there. Everything's iced over all the time. There's not anybody living down there. They shipwrecked on this island. The only other thing on that island was a whaling station on the other end of it. It was a mountainous island, snow everywhere, cold. They didn't have any supplies. It was an arduous trek. Finally, they reached the whaling station and got help. After that, each one of them talked independently about how each one of them had felt while they were on that trek across the frozen tundra or whatever it was, that there had been another presence there with them. Each had felt that there was actually 4 people there instead of 3. That 4th person was walking silently by their side. And when they reached safety, they no longer felt that presence of that person. In the mid-1900s, a mountain climber was trying to be the first person to ever reach the summit of Mount Everest. And he started out with a group of men. It was a difficult climb. The weather was frigid. It was horrible. And as you get up that high, you suffer the effects of hypoxia and not having enough oxygen. Everybody else gave up little by little as they kept getting higher to give up and cut it down. But this guy was determined to go on. And he went till he got to 1,000 feet from the summit. And he turned back. He knew he would die if he kept going. And later he wrote this: all the time I was climbing along, I had a strong feeling that I was accompanied by a second person. The feeling was so strong that it completely eliminated all loneliness I might otherwise have felt. And he said that this feeling was so strong that one time when he was going to eat something, he pulled something to eat out of his pocket and reached over there and offered it to this other entity. And it's nobody thanked you. This is the story of a man named Ron DeFrancesco on 9/11 in the World Trade Center. He was at work. The first plane that hit the World Trade Center hit the North Tower, and he was in the South Tower. And I remember seeing this on TV, seeing this man interviewed. And he said, there they were in the South Tower, and whoever was in charge of security, told them to evacuate, because you didn't know what was going to happen. And he started to evacuate. Then they changed their mind. And they said, no, don't evacuate. Our building's fine. It's a building next to it. Well, it wasn't long until that one was hit. So he had called his wife and said, I'm fine. It's the other building that's hit, and I'm going to stay here and work. And so then he just decided on his own. He said, I'm sitting duck in this building. I'm going to get out of here. Just as he started for the elevator, the plane hit his building. So he started down the stairway. People were telling him to go up because that's where they were supposed to go, in case of fire. But he said, I'm not going up, I'm going down, I'm getting out of here. So he started to go down. And when he got down about the 80th floor, there was people huddled down there, and he had to crawl over them. He just about got overwhelmed by smoke. And then he was about to just lay down on the floor, and he said, all of a sudden he heard a voice saying, get up and go on. Get up and go on. He said it was a man's voice. So he got up and he went on. And he heard something calling his name. Down here, down the lower floor. Calling his name, calling his name. Then he got to a point where the stairway was on fire. He ran through that fire. Then he got to a point where part of it had collapsed and he couldn't find a way around it. And he sat down there and he was just sat down there and died. And something said, get up and go on. And he said he got up and he was able to just barely crawl through to get through that debris and get out of there. he was the last person that exited that building before it collapsed. The last one. Now there are many other accounts like these, accounts of people who were in extreme survival situations. There's several of these from 9/11 with people in this building. We've talked about some other ones of those before. There's several of those that people had experiences like that. There's another man in a hotel building, a Hilton hotel, I think it was a Hilton, next door to that stuff, and that got destroyed in the other buildings, and he had a similar experience. Something urging him to go on. Go on. The commonality among all of these is that the presence they felt was so real that it was like somebody was standing there. Somebody was doing something. Some of them report being touched, feeling something pulling them. Some of them report hearing their name. Some of them report saying, "Get up, get up." Now, if we had to explain this, our first response might be to think that these people just had an extremely strong will to live, and they were hearing things and all this and the other. But there's a doctor named Claude Piantadosi, who's a pulmonologist at Duke, and he has studied extreme survival situations regarding, in extreme survival situations, the difference between the people that died and the people who didn't. And he says, rarely does one person survive under extreme conditions when another dies simply because the survivor has the will to live. Will to live does not explain that there's something else going on. These experiences happen not only in situations as extreme as the World Trade Center, but also in situations that are not quite that extreme. Maybe you've experienced them too. I know some of you have, because you told me about it. Perhaps you've experienced something in a particularly difficult time of your life. Perhaps you have sensed a presence with you. Interestingly enough, there's a flip side of this. Sometimes people who feel these things are trying to help them, and sometimes people feel it's trying to do them harm. And so there's two of these. One instance is you can feel the presence somebody's trying to help you. You can feel the presence somebody's trying to hurt you. And they're not rare. And so, in fact, they're so not rare that they've been the subject of scientific study. Science is at a loss to explain them. Since science does not believe in any kind of spiritual power anyway, obviously, you know where they're going to go to look. They're going to go to psychology. That's how they explain everything. They say it's a psychological defense mechanism. It's a form of hallucination. It's the brain in various ways playing tricks on us. It's some kind of automatic defense mechanism built into the way our brains work. But this Dr. Piantadosi at Duke says there's more to it than psychology, because he identifies physiological changes in people. That means changes actually in their physical body under some of these situations. And no one can explain it. Most importantly, no one has been able to explain why these things happen to some people and not to others. Although there were a number of people on 9/11 that reported these experiences, a lot of other people didn't. And so it doesn't happen to everybody. We just don't know. You don't need to turn to science to look at it, because they start from handicap from the very beginning. They're going to mark it down to psychology because that's what it's got to be. It can't be anything else but you hallucinating. But you know, Christians who believe in a spiritual realm and who believe in spiritual powers would not be at a loss to explain it. Maybe it is these spiritual powers coming to our aid. It's interesting to note that of these people who report these things, not just religious people. It's not just dedicated Christians or whatever that report these things. It's people that aren't religious at all that report these things. Science tells us they're hallucinating. You can't help but notice in the Gospels that demons and unclean spirits and angels are everywhere. All kinds of spiritual beings are everywhere. After all, casting out demons was one of the main things Jesus did. Their activity is widespread in the Gospels. The activity of angels is widespread in the Gospels. Masses of people are affected by stuff like this in the Gospels. Although we usually don't think of it this way because our versions of Christianity have been sanitized of it, the Bible gives the view that the world is full of spiritual activity. Sometimes the bad wins out. That doesn't mean that good wasn't trying. It just means that sometimes the bad won. That's because we live in an age before evil is defeated. And that at least partially helps explain why some people survive these things and others don't. I remember hearing about one man on 9/11. He was supposed to be at work at 9 o'clock. And if he had been, or 8 o'clock or whatever, but if he'd have been to work on time, he'd have been sitting there right in the path where one of the airplanes bursted through the building. But he had stayed up late the night before watching TV and he overslept. And he said his desk would have been right there where the hole was. What, did he oversleep as a coincidence? I don't know. If he didn't oversleep as a coincidence, if that was not a coincidence, then why didn't God let everybody oversleep so the buildings would have been empty when they flew into them? I don't know. I don't have an explanation for that. However, I'm not going to dismiss all this stuff as hallucinations or the brain playing tricks on people or some kind of built-in psychological defense mechanism. I'm going to consider the possibility that these experiences are real. Maybe we do live in a world teeming with spiritual powers, both bad and good. Maybe the bad ones are at work trying to win. Maybe the good ones are at work trying to defeat them. Maybe that is the way things are. One of the things that has always drawn me to Christianity is that at its best, Christianity has always maintained that there is more to things than we see. Really. That's one of the main things that has all my life drawn me to Christianity. At its best, it says, it tells us, there's more to things than we can see. There's more to things than we know. There's more than this right here around you. Something lies beyond that you can't even imagine. And you see, that's what Christianity really is. It's a way of reaching to that lies beyond us, that we can't see, but that we know it's there. You see, if you're a Christian, it necessarily means that you are open to mystery. You have left certainty that you understand it all behind, and you have this sense, we're involved in this big thing that I can't even comprehend. It's a mystery. Let's not blind ourselves by always looking in only one direction. Let's not blind ourselves by rejecting everything that's not in the direction we look. I truly believe that when we get to heaven and see things as they really are, we'll find out that things were actually a lot different than we thought.